Hello and welcome to Good Drugs. I'm Michael Fitter, PhD, and I'm of the belief that in order to get through this thing called life, we need potions, elixirs, magic pills, and it's just a matter of finding good ones. And the good drug today is Dimethly Fumarate, which is used to treat multiple sclerosis. Now, DMF, as the acronym goes, is a very impressive drug. And it's impressive in the sense that it has spawned lots of biosimilars, which is a good, or at least one biosimilar, which is a good indication that the drug is effective because people are trying to copy it, essentially. But what's interesting about dimethyl fumarate for the treatment of MS is that this drug was actually already being used to treat an autoimmune condition called psoriasis, which is more of like a skin irritation. You kind of like your whole body breaks out in a rash. And then in the sort of the late 90s, early 2000s, people started experimenting with it for multiple sclerosis, which is also an autoimmune condition. And it showed really promising effects. And not only did it show promising effects, but its safety profile wasn't alarming. So let's talk a little bit about how DMF works. So it's a small molecule, it's a fumarate. It gets metabolized in the body from dimethyl fumarate to monomethyl fumarate. And its mechanism of action is very diverse. It can do lots of different things. It isn't sort of as specific as a monoclonal antibody or some sort of enzyme inhibitor, for example. But one of the main things that it does is activate a transcription factor called NRF2. And NRF2 stands for nuclear factor erythroid 2 related factor 2. So that's a mouthful. But NRF2 is a transcription factor that turns on genes that fight oxidative stress. So it is essentially the antioxidant hero. So the reason why that's relevant in multiple sclerosis is that reactive oxygen species are one of the ways that they think the immune cell uses to harm neurons to begin with. So in MS, the immune system is overactive. It chews on myelin. It's sort of like the rubber wire, sorry, the rubber coating of a wire, and the immune system sort of chews it off, leaving these exposed wires that can get frayed and die, and that's why you get clinical symptoms of MS. And one of the assumptions or the foundations of the value proposition for DMF is that this damage that's being caused by the immune system to myelin is mediated or being driven by reactive oxygen species. That's sort of the bullets that various immune cells are using to injure your nervous system. And so what NRF2 does is it cranks out signals that suppress oxidative stress and have sort of antioxidant capacity. So essentially trying to sort of like dump water on a fire. So if that fire is burning, and reactive oxygen species are those fires that are sort of burning throughout your brain, DMF turns on the fire alarm, and then NRF2 comes out with a fire hose and puts out the fire. And that's essentially how DMF works, or at least that's sort of its main driver. It does have other functional nuances to it, but that's the simplest one. So it stimulates NRF2, which is a transcription factor that turns on an antioxidant response. Simple enough. So DMF was championed in MS first by Biogen, and it is marketed as Tecfidera. And it was one of the more successful oral therapies for multiple sclerosis. The reason why I say oral is that MS now in 2020 has a lot of treatment options. There's probably at least 15, or at least close to it. But 15 years ago, when a lot of this science was being done, there were options for it, but they were imperfect. So the first drugs that got approved for MS were interferons, another drug called Copaxone, but they were all injectables, and you got them either every day or every couple of days, maybe once a week. And they all, for the most part, other than Copaxone, cause these things called flu-like symptoms, where you just feel like crap the day you get it, because interferons are messing with your antiviral response and sort of like puts you in a state of feeling sick. So people can get like aches and pains and things like that. So interferons worked to suppress the symptoms of MS, but people didn't like them. They weren't well tolerated. Then there's another drug for MS called Tysabri, which is a monoclonal antibody, so now something very specific, that prevents immune cells from crossing the blood-brain barrier and doing damage to the nervous system, which did great clinically, and patients on natalizumab or Tisabri do great. But you don't have the same degree of immune surveillance in the brain, and you can get opened up to an opportunistic infection called progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, or PML. So Tisabri was very much a high-risk, high-reward drug, so also imperfect. One of the next drugs that came online was a drug called Gilenya, which is good for MS, has a really good efficacy profile. The way it works is it holds immune cells in your lymph nodes, so they're not circulating throughout your bloodstream to do damage to the nervous system. They're just sort of trapped in the various sort of subway stations of the immune system throughout your body. It does a good job, but what it invariably causes is lymphopenia, which means low circulating lymphocytes because they're being sequestered. So people on Gilenya are also at risk, although it's very small, of PML. There's also a weird signal with the heart where you can have what's called bradycardia, which means you have a low heart rate. So you have to be very careful when you initiate Gilenya to make sure you don't have a weak heart. And it has spawned biosimilars as well, just like Tecfidera, that have a cleaner sort of cardiac signal. So there are follow-on what are called S1P1s, which is the target that Gilenya uses, that don't have the same degree of cardiac signal. So at the time in 2012, 13, 14, when Tecfidera was sort of coming out of its shell as a molecule, you had this sort of hodgepodge of treatment options. Another one that I didn't mention is called Aubagio, which is another oral, and it suppresses immune cell proliferation. And it does a decent job of MS. It's sort of in the same efficacy realm as the interferons, but it has some unfortunate side effects. It can give you alopecia, it causes your hair to fall out. It's also teratogenic, which means it causes birth defects, so people that are of childbearing age shouldn't take it. So also imperfect. So Tecfidera was this drug that already had a history with psoriasis, and it showed really strong efficacy in MS, and it was better than interferons. It's comparable with Gilenya, albeit maybe not as good, but close. And its safety profile didn't have these major warts like PML, although there have been people that have gotten PML on DMF. But there wasn't a alarming safety signal attached to it during its clinical development that was sort of like that was up there with flu-like symptoms or PML, or bradycardia. And then when the drug was approved, it was a very, very successful launch, and a lot of people got on it. But the thing is that there was an adverse event signal in the clinical development of the drug that became a much bigger deal than I think people were expecting, and that's its gastrointestinal effects. And so for whatever reason, DMF does great at activating this antioxidant response, but it really tears up your stomach. And people that take DMF, particularly when you first get started with it, they oftentimes experience nausea, vomiting, a lot of really unpleasant side effects associated with gastrointestinal intolerability. And this was known in the clinical development because in the phase 2 trial, they tried giving the drug once a day, twice a day, or even 3 times a day. And as you would imagine, with the dose response, the more drug you gave, the better the patients did. But the problem was that the more drugs that you gave, the harder it was on the patient's stomach. And so Tecfidera, as it's prescribed, is a twice daily pill. And it's twice daily because if you took it all at once, it would really hurt your stomach. And so they've tried to dilute how often you have to take it to get it into your system in a way that's palatable. And even going a step further, what's interesting about Tecfidera is that the drug is actually delivered through these micro tablets. So when you get it, it doesn't dissolve in your small intestine. What it does is the outer coating dissolves, and then these microspheres essentially disperse throughout your GI tract. So the drug is essentially dissolving twice to sort of spread out how it is penetrated across your epithelia in your small intestine to be more tolerable. So this GI issue was something that was approached intelligently, but it is a real sticking point for Tecfidera because a lot of people it really upsets their stomach when they first get started on it. That tends to decrease over time, and people kind of get used to it. You can do things like take it with food to kind of make it a little easier on you. But it was something that wasn't going away. And so this opened up the door for opportunity for biosimilars. And a biosimilar that came online recently that is essentially the same active ingredient as Tecfidera is called Vumerity, which is a very similar molecule. It has the same active ingredient as Tecfidera, but instead of being dimethyl fumarate, it's diroxylimyl fumarate, and it is designed to be more tolerable on your GI symptoms. So it's essentially trying to deliver the exact same efficacy of DMF that Tecfidera does, but just be easier on your stomach. And what's interesting is that Vumerity was developed and championed originally by Alkermes, which is a company I've spoken about before, who is a very opportunistic player in the pharma space who uses technology to carve out new options. And then they ended up licensing the treatment to Biogen, who now markets Vumerity. So Biogen owns both Tecfidera and Vumerity, and that's sort of it's sort of like Michelob and Michelob Ultra. But I think that I've spent a lot of time talking about the hang up of dimethyl fumarate in terms of its GI tolerability, and that's more to express why biosimilars have come onto the market to sort of replace the original Tecfidera. But in the grand scheme of things, the drug itself is actually remarkably effective. And if you can get through these initial GI symptoms at first, sort of the first maybe 10 weeks, the drug is actually really sort of stable and boring. And that's a good thing in medicine. A lot of neurologists like patients to be on DMF because they don't have to worry about them. There isn't if they can get through the GI tolerability phase at first, and they can kind of get used to and adhere to how to take the drug, then it's not something that has another alarming signal. It's not going to affect their heart rate. Their hair's not going to fall out. They're not going to get flu-like symptoms. Another side effect of DMF that does happen is flushing. So, like your skin gets sort of red, and you can get uncomfortable. So these tend to be more inconveniences rather than really robust side effects. Patients will still discontinue for these types of things, but they're not as scary as some of the other side effects that some of the other drugs had caused, like PML. But on the topic of PML, there actually have been patients that have gotten PML on DMF, and that actually speaks more to some of the uncertainties about how it works. So for some reason, a small percentage of people that are on DMF experience a drop in lymphocyte counts, and they don't really know why. So it's sort of a small fraction get this drop below what they call 500 times 10 to the ninth or whatever the number is. So you get below 500 lymphocytes per whatever circulating through your bloodstream. And when your lymphocyte counts are that low, you're open to opportunistic infection. And people that have gotten PML on DMF all have these really low circulating lymphocytes. So it's not totally clear why this happens. You get dropped circulating lymphocytes with Gilenya because that's how the drug works. But for DMF, they're not sure why it actually happens that way. But suffice it to say, if you can kind of get through this initial complexity of initiating the drug, getting up and running on it, it's actually something that you can really lean on. And there's not only been Tecfidera, but Vumerity as well. And it's a really reliable option. And what I would talk about where Tecfidera fits in the armamentarium of MS, it's kind of like it's kind of like Honda. It's something that's really reliable. It's going to get the job done. You can kind of set it and forget it and don't worry about it. And scientifically, it may not be as interesting as something like a monoclonal antibody or something that has these really sophisticated mechanisms of action, but it also doesn't carry the baggage. It isn't killing anything in your body. It's reversible. It's just a pill. You don't have to there's no needles involved. It's a treatment option that I think at the time when it was first launched or first investigated in the early 2000s, that's what the MS community was looking for. Something that's an oral, that's not a lot of baggage, that I can take safely and I can just kind of go on with my life. And that's why Biogen bet big on it. And Tecfidera is probably the most sold MS drug that there is. But nothing lasts forever. And its warts, which every drug has, left opportunity for a drug like Vumerity to come in and improve on its existing foundation. But what's interesting is that now, having been in the MS space for close to 10 years, the oral versus injectable conversation doesn't seem to be quite the way that it was. I think some of the more popular drugs for MS, like Ocrevus, for example, is an infusion. And so I don't know if people have the same types of hangups about needles that they did 15 years ago. And now that there's so many options in MS, I don't know if mode of delivery is as big a factor in treatment selection. But Dimethly Fumarate is a really good drug in the sense that it can make people feel normal and healthy and not have to be caught up in their disease. And that's a big deal. Its efficacy is really important to just sort of hit the disease as hard as you can, but tolerability is a big deal too. And safety is a big deal. And while Dimethly Fumarate has these GI side effects, they're much more manageable and tolerable and less scary than knowing that, for example, that you're going to feel sick every week, or knowing that you could get a life-threatening infection, or knowing that this could really affect your heart, or you could have severe opportunistic infection, because that's how the drug is working. So in terms of ways it's manipulating your immune system, it's pretty modest. And I think that's what makes it a really good drug. And it may not be the most exciting drug out there. It may not be the most complex and interesting, but it really does a good job. And for those that have, who just want a Honda, who don't need a Tesla, who don't need a crotch rocket, or don't need something really sophisticated, they just want something simple that they can rely on, DMF is a good choice. And so I personally have had more fun with drugs that are more complex and more and have more problems that have to be solved, like Tysabri, which I think is just so awesome, but that doesn't make it better. And this is my attempt to kind of give DAP to a drug that is a really good one, and and evidence of that is simply the fact that it's the most prescribed drug out there in MS. And also consider the fact that it has a biosimilar. So that's also something to be said for it. But anyway, hope you enjoyed this. Take care out there, and if you're interested in more good drugs, subscribe to my channel.